to Staff Works Explained. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can also watch other videos that we have done on different topics. In this video, we are talking about the Dangote East African Refinery, Lamu, and also the LAPSSET corridor, where we say it's a test. And the question we're asking here is, can Northern Kenya become East Africa's new logistics spine? For years, the Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor, better known as LAPSSET, has been sold as a transformative answer to East Africa's dependence on the Mombasa trade route. Now, the proposed 700,000 barrels per day refinery at Lamu gives that vision a potentially powerful industrial anchor. But the real story is bigger than the refinery or a new port. It's about whether Kenya can turn a largely incomplete transport corridor across the northern Kenya into an integrated system of ports, pipelines, roads, rail, storage, as well as industries. And whether that system can attract enough cargo to challenge Mombasa and the established northern corridor. In this analysis, we examine how the proposed refinery fits into LAPSSET, why Lamu viability depends on transforming northern Kenya from a transit gap into a logistics backbone, what the pipelines and rail could realistically change, and why the idea of Lamu securing a permanent monopoly over regional trade deserves considerably more caution than the headlines suggest. Let's start by looking at the refinery, how it changes the equation. The most important development is not simply that Dangote is interested in Kenya. It is where the proposed refinery is being positioned. Dangote Group has confirmed that it is considering Lamu for its planned East African refinery, with the company citing commercial and technical consideration behind the choice and inviting Tanzania to participate in the investment. Reuters reported in July 2026 that the proposed facility could have the capacity of 700 barrels per day, potentially making it the largest refinery in East Africa. The project is expected to take up 3 years to build once fully advanced, and is intended to supply Kenya and neighboring markets. That distinction is important. A refinery is not just another factory waiting for trucks. A large refinery creates a continuous requirement for crude supply, marine handling, storage tanks, product evacuation, pipelines, electricity, water, maintenance services, and a large industrial ecosystem. In project management terms, it can become an anchor project, an investment large enough to create demand for several other pieces of infrastructure around it. That is precisely what LAPSSET has lacked for the much of its history. Not ambition, but enough commercially dependable cargo to justify the enormous cost of connecting the ambitions together. The original LAPSSET concept already envisaged a refinery at Lamu, crude oil pipelines, refined product pipelines, railways, highways, which are linking the coast to Isiolo, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. The difference today is that Dangote brings an established Africa industrial operator, as well as an existing refinery business model, into a project that previously depended heavily on government-led infrastructure sequencing. The proposed refinery, therefore, does not create LAPSSET. It potentially gives LAPSSET a stronger economic reason to exist. But a refinery does not automatically make a corridor. That's important to note. This is where the discussion needs to move away from political symbolism and towards project economics. Lamu Port already exists. Its first 3 berths are operational, and the Kenya Ports Authority reported a dramatic increase in cargo handled at Lamu in 2025, where it announced that 799,000 metric tons compared with 74,380 tons in 2024. Container traffic reached 55,687 TEUs. Those numbers are encouraging, but they need to be put into perspective. Mombasa handled 45.45 million tons of cargo and 2.11 million TEUs in 2025. Transit cargo through this port alone reached 15.88 million tons. In other words, Lamu rapid percentage growth is occurring from a much smaller base. This is not criticism of Lamu, it is simply the scale of the challenge it's facing. Newport does not become competitive because it has deep water and modern berths. It becomes competitive when a shipper can reliably move cargo from the vessel to its final market at a lower total cost, including port charges, inland transport, customs clearance, insurance, inventory delays, as well as border procedures and risk of disruption. This is where, or that is where the future of Lamu will be decided, far beyond Lamu Island and Manda Bay. The decisive geography is northern Kenya, where we see that northern Kenya is the missing piece. LAPSSET strategic promise is to convert the vast northern part of Kenya from an area largely bypassed by major commercial transport flows into a connected economic corridor. That means Lamu must eventually connect essentially with Isiolo, then branch towards Ethiopia and South Sudan, while also connecting with Kenya's domestic production and consumption centers. The roads are therefore not secondary infrastructure, neither are railway and pipelines. They are the corridor. The existing project framework envisages an SGR from Lamu towards Isiolo, with onward connections towards Moyale and Ethiopia and towards Nakodok and South Sudan. It also envisaged a crude and refined product pipeline running along parts of the same geography, but the railway remains a major future investment rather than an operating alternative to the Mombasa-Nairobi logistics system. Earlier LAPSSET planning put the cost of railway network roughly 10.4 billion US dollars, including rolling stock, while more recent planning documents have put wider infrastructure requirement even higher. That raises the central project question: who pays and who guarantees the cargo? The railway built before there is enough freight risks becoming an expensive asset with low utilization. A railway built after industrial demand has matured may arrive too late to capture the market. This is classic infrastructure sequencing problem. The answer is unlikely to be one mega project delivered all at once. A more credible approach is to build around bankable cargo first: petroleum products, containers, bulk, commodities, livestock, agricultural export, minerals, and industrial inputs. Once predictable freight volumes exist, rail investments becomes easier to justify. Then there is the pipeline, which may be more important than the railway. For the refinery, pipelines matter even more than rail. A refinery producing hundreds of thousands of barrels a day cannot depend on the thousands of individual tanker trucks to evacuate its output. The economics would be poor, the roads would be overloaded, and the operational risk would rise sharply. A pipeline, by contrast, provides a continuous high-volume movement system. The LAPSSET concept has long included both crude oil export pipeline and refined product pipelines. African Union PIDA project documentation currently lists the proposed LAPSSET crude pipelines at an estimated 3.04 billion US dollars, with the objective of transporting crude from Kenya's Lokicha Basin and potentially to South Sudan to Lamu. That is strategically important because it could create two-way energy logic. Crude comes towards the industrial system and then refined products move away from it. If the refinery is supplied through Lamu and its product can be piped towards the inland market, the corridor begins to behave like an integrated industrial network rather than a simple road from the port to the interior. That is the point which LAPSSET becomes commercially interesting. But there is But there is a major caveat. Many of these pipelines and rail links remain planned or under development. They should not be treated as though they are already functioning infrastructure. And then the question is, can Lamu really bypass Mombasa port? Yes, but not in the simplistic sense that Lamu will make Mombasa irrelevant. Mombasa is too deeply embedded into the region economic for that. It has established shipping line relationships, custom systems, freight forwarders, trucking companies, inland container depots, rail connections, warehouses, financial services, and decades of accumulated commercial knowledge. The northern corridor also continues to improve. Mombasa's 2025 numbers show this clearly. Cargo increased strongly, while the Kenya Ports Authority is expanding capacity and improving terminal systems. The northern corridor owns performance reporting, however, shows that congestions remain the real issue. The average vessel waiting time before the berth at Mombasa reached 6.5 or 6.4 days in the first quarter of 2025, well above the corridor's target. This is Lamu opportunities, but congestion alone is not a business model. If Mombasa becomes faster, more automated, and better connected to the inland rail and road systems, Lamu competitive advantages narrows. If Lamu becomes a reliable alternative with direct shipping services, efficient customs, dependable roads, pipelines, and eventually rail, the competition becomes much more serious. The strategic objective should therefore not to be, to defeat Mombasa. It should be to create a second high capacity gateway so that East Africa trade is no longer dependent on one maritime system. That distinction is crucial. And now the monopoly question. The idea of that LAPSSET could eventually secure permanent monopoly on regional trade flows is attractive from a geopolitical perspective, but weak from a project management perspective. Ports compete for that matter. Cargo owners select routes according to the cost, reliability, frequency, border efficiencies, as well as risk. Ethiopia can use Djibouti. Uganda has access to Mombasa and alternative regional routes. Tanzania has Dar es Salaam and Tanga. South Sudan geography give it an interest in multiple options. No government can permanently guarantee that cargo will use one corridor. What Kenya can do is to make Lamu difficult to ignore. That requires three things. First, the corridor must be reliable. A port connected to an incomplete highway network is not a corridor. Second, it must be commercially competitive. Infrastructure investors and shipping lines respond to cargo volumes and predictable returns, not simply strategic declarations. Third, the corridor must create value inland. If northern Kenya remains primarily a place that trucks pass through, LAPSSET will struggle to generate the economic density required to sustain it. This is why industrial parks, logistics centers, storage facilities, agro-processing plants, mineral processing, as well as the energy-intensive manufacturing matters almost as much as the port itself. The objective is is to make cargo originate along the corridor, not merely pass through. Then we say that Dangote could provide the first industrial gravity. This is where the proposed refinery becomes potentially transformative. A major refinery could generate demand for storage terminals, chemical industries, transportation services, engineering, contractors, maintenance companies, power generation, water infrastructure, as well as downstream manufacturers. It could also provide a predictable base load for port operations. In logistics, base load simply means a relatively dependable volume of cargo that allows infrastructure operators to plan around something more certain than occasional shipments. That matters enormously for Lamu. If a refinery, crude terminal, products pipeline, and industrial zone develop together, they can provide enough recurring activity to justify further investment in roads and eventually rail. Additional industries can then join the corridor because the first infrastructure already exists. That creates a potentially powerful investment cycle. There is port, refinery, storage, pipelines, industrial activity, more cargo, better logistics, economics, and also more investment. But the reverse is also possible. Port, incomplete hinterland, insufficient cargo, That leads to low utilization, that leads to weak private investment, and that leads to stalled expansion. The difference will be execution. Then we talk about security and geography, which cannot be ignored. There's another issue that tends to disappear from infrastructure presentation. Northern Kenya is not an empty map waiting for a railway. It is a region of communities, pastoral economics, fragile economics, ecosystems for that matter, security challenges, and long distances between major population centers. Building infrastructure without building a local economic participation creates social and operational risk. A pipeline or a railway crossing hundreds of kilometers of sparsely populated territories requires security, maintenance access, community agreements, as well as emergency response systems. The corridor must therefore be treated as an operating environment, not simply a construction project. That means measuring success not only by kilometers of road or railway completed, but by freight moved, turnaround time, asset utilization, industrial investment, local employment, custom clearance time, as well as revenue which is generated. Those are the indicators that will tell investors whether LAPSSET is working. Then there is the real competition and the reliability. The real competition, we say, is the reliability. The most consequential question facing Lamu is therefore not whether it can handle large ships. It can. There's no doubt about that. Nor is the question whether it occupies a strategically attractive position on the Kenyan coast. That one we know it does. The question is whether a manufacturing company in Ethiopia, a trader in South Sudan, or a distributor in northern Uganda will eventually look at two possible routes and conclude that Lamu is safer, faster, and cheaper option. That decision will be made hundreds of kilometers inland. A port can be built in a few years. A corridor is built through years of dependable operations. And that's why the Dangote proposal deserves attention beyond the headline figures of 700,000 barrels per day. 700,000 barrels per day. If implemented, it could supply the industrial demand that LAPSSET has always needed, but it will not by itself solve the railway financing problem, complete the highways, secure crude supply, establish regional product markets, or persuade shipping lines to redesign their networks. Those are separate project risks. Now in conclusion, we say that Lamu does not need to replace the Mombasa port. LAPSSET's most realistic future is not as monument designed to dethrone Mombasa. It is as a second East Africa logistics spine built around a different economic geography. Dangote's proposed Lamu refinery could become the industrial anchor that finally gives that spine commercial weight. Lamu Port has already moved beyond the purely symbolic stage, recording substantial growth in 2025, yet its numbers remain modest beside Mombasa's and the important components of LAPSSET, especially the long-distance railway and major pipeline systems, which have not even started. The strategic opportunity is therefore clear, but so is the warning. Lamu will become viable only if Kenya stops thinking of it primarily as a port project and starts managing LAPSSET as an integrated economic system. That means sequencing infrastructure around rail cargo, securing anchor investment, and developing northern Kenya as a production and logistics zone, connecting Ethiopia and South Sudan through dependable transport links, and treating Mombasa as not as an enemy to be eliminated, but as the benchmark against which Lamu must compete. The ultimate test will be brutally simple. Can LAPSSET move a ton of cargo or a barrel of petroleum more reliably, predictably, and competitively than the established routes? If the answer eventually becomes yes, Lamu will not need to be a monopoly. The market will give the port or area something more durable, a permanent place in East Africa's trade architecture. So thank you for reaching this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can also watch other videos that you have done on different topics and on Dangote Refinery, Lamu, and also the LAPSSET corridor. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.